Our text today is John 14, verses 1 through 7. And in this text, Jesus is speaking to his disciples at one of the most tense and anxious moments of their lives. Let's read together. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Do not let your hearts be troubled. These beautiful words of comfort and assurance are spoken by Jesus at the Last Supper. Again, to his disciples in a very anxious and tense-ridden time in their lives. Do not let your hearts be troubled. It's a wonderful thought, isn't it? But is it even possible? The word Jesus uses here, troubled, it means like to be agitated and all stirred up on the inside. Kind of like this Awana award I have here. And, we shake it all up and we just see kind of everything just stirring around and just, all jumbled up. And we know what it's like to feel like that on the inside. Something comes up in our life and then all of a sudden we're all stirred up. And it could be just sadness, grief, loneliness, family tension, fear of the future, just an overwhelming schedule, and we get all, worked up inside. So let me ask, how relevant is this message to you? How long has it been since your heart has been troubled? My guess is not long. Maybe you're even watching this today with a very troubled heart, and I'm sure some of you are. There's always something going on that keeps us up at night, right? I mean, either we're trying to process something that just happened and we're trying to make sense of it and come to terms with it, or there's something that is coming around the corner that we're anxious and nervous about because there's all kinds of uncertainty, or we know what's going to happen and we're just afraid of it happening. Troubled hearts, there's a lot of that going around. When I was working on this message and I was typing in, on my computer, the phrase troubled hearts and similar types of things, all of a sudden my screen, I was getting all kinds of ads on Google and on social media for, things like antidepressants and alternative therapies and dietary supplements and counseling and all these kind of things, because I think there's a lot of people who are searching for a cure for a troubled heart. So what's your cure? How do you handle it? How do you respond to a troubled heart? Maybe you take a passive approach and you just sleep it off, or you park yourself in front of the TV and you go into a Netflix coma, just trying to shut everything else out, or maybe you drink something or smoke something to take the edge off. There's also kind of more active ways we try to deal with troubled hearts. We busy ourselves, we clean up, or we rearrange a room so we have just some sense of control and order to our lives. Now, you know how you try to respond to a troubled heart. How well do those things help settle you down? I mean, so when again, life is like this. How well do those things work? I would say for most of us, it might work for a moment or very temporarily, but it never like really solves anything. The couch is in a new spot, but the problem that caused all the turmoil inside of us, it still exists. Now, in our text today, Jesus offers an antidote to a troubled heart. He offers a real cure for it. So let's jump in and see what Jesus says. Now, when he says to his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled," he says it because their hearts are troubled. He sees it in them. He can sense it. It is obvious. Now, why are they troubled so deeply? Well, a number of reasons. First, they're in a very tense environment. They're in Jerusalem for Passover. The city is on edge. There's all kind of threats and plots being, put together against Jesus, and they're all a part of that. Jesus has just said that one of them would betray Jesus. Jesus says another one of them would deny him. And then Jesus said, and the rest of them were going to run away from him. Jesus has been talking of death and his impending death, and all of this has them very troubled on the inside. But I think the greatest reason, the most pressing reason that they are troubled is what Jesus has just said, and actually he says it twice in this conversation. He tells the disciples, "I'm leaving you. I'm leaving you." He goes, and I'm going someplace, and you can't come with me. This had to just really undo the disciples. They had devoted their entire lives to Jesus. They had abandoned everything, their livelihoods, their homes to follow him. They've done this for 3 years. And now, when everything is at its worst, he's leaving them. What about all the promises he's made? What about all their hopes and dreams? And in the midst of that, they say to Jesus basically, like, you can't leave us. Like, not now. Like, we need you. We love you. Like, who's going to be in charge? Who's going to lead this whole thing that you got going? And they're overwhelmed by the sense of loss, the loss of Jesus. Now, Jesus tells them what they need to do, right? He says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Here's what you need to do in order to fix that." And he says, "Believe in God. Believe also in me." Okay, so believe, like trust. It's the same word. Believe, trust. You need to trust in me. But the question is then, well, what are we to believe about God? What are we to believe about Jesus that will calm our hearts and settle our souls? Okay, believe. Believe what? Well, the answer for that comes in the following verses. And as we discuss this, know that this is one of the most misunderstood and misapplied pieces of all of Scripture. So hopefully, when we get through this, you will have a new and much more accurate understanding of what the Bible's talking about, what Jesus is talking about here. So in verse 2, Jesus says this is what he wants us to believe in for comfort and assurance. He says, "In my Father's house are many rooms." This is also written in the King James translation. "In my Father's house are many mansions." And this is a phrase that many people are familiar with. "In my Father's house are many mansions." And here's what we think this means. That when we die and we go to heaven, there's going to be a big house waiting for us. Like, that'll be our big reward. When we die, we get to have this giant mansion. And maybe we think about, like, it'll have like this grand entry and a marble staircase and oak paneling in the library or den, that there is crystal chandeliers, a beautifully manicured lawn and gardens, and a big, Olympic-sized swimming pool in the back. Maybe we think of a place like Downton Abbey, this like English countryside estate, and that's where that's what the big prize is. You get to live in a place like that forever. Now, for a few reasons, that understanding really makes no sense at all in the context of what's going on. First of all, the word meaning is completely off. In the Greek, and in the Latin, and then in the English, That's not what it means. So the word we're talking about here is room. In my Father's house are many rooms. Now in the Greek, it just means a dwelling place, just a kind of a modest dwelling place, a place where you are. It has no indication of, luxury or extravagance. It's just a place. When the Bible was translated into Latin, the word for room there was mansionis. And that word at the time, again, it just meant a regular dwelling place. It had no indication of anything grand or luxurious. Now, in the 17th century, when this was then translated into English in the King James, they picked the English word that most closely aligned with this Latin word mansionis and the Greek word. And the word was mansions. Now, here's the thing. In 17th century England, there was not that understanding that mansion meant something giant and big and huge and lavish. It had that same meaning, just a modest dwelling place, a gathering place. So in the Greek, Latin, and original English, it had no intent of grandeur and luxury, okay? So only in the English language in the last couple hundred years has that word mansion kind of switched meanings or evolved, but that's kind of what is in our minds and kind of makes us think of this. Now, so the word meaning is off. Second, it doesn't address the problem. This understanding about this, mansion in heaven, it doesn't address the problem that the disciples were facing. What was the problem the disciples had? What was causing their hearts to be troubled? They were afraid of losing Jesus. They were afraid of this loss. And he doesn't comfort them by saying, it's okay that I'll never be with you again, because one day in a long time, there's going to be a big mansion for you to live in, and it's really nice, and you're going to really enjoy being there, right? That would provide no comfort for the need they had, especially in light of what was going to happen. Soon he would be arrested, taken away from them. Within hours, they would be, a witness to his trial and then his crucifixion. The idea of a heavenly mansion would have been the last thing on their minds. And finally, it's just not logical. It just doesn't make any sense. Let's think about this. How are we to understand the language, our Father's house? God needs no house. God doesn't need a shelter. He doesn't need walls or a roof. God is spirit. So the idea of him needing a house or having a house, it just doesn't add up. We don't see any mention of a house in Eden. We don't see any mention of a house anywhere in Revelation or all through the Scripture talking about heaven and where God resides in heaven. And in addition to this house not making sense, then what are we to make of Jesus saying he goes to prepare a place for us? Are we thinking Jesus went into heaven to do some construction? He had this project to build the world's or the universe's largest subdivision. So Jesus is going to prepare a place. Is it like he's got like a tool belt and hammer and nails? He's pouring concrete. He's putting up shiplap. He's installing granite countertops. He's laying sod in the yard. That just doesn't make sense at all. And I think intuitively we all know that's not what it means. And so when we understand this verse literally, in my Father's house are many rooms, I go to prepare a place for you, we make the same mistakes that the disciples would often make. And that mistake was this. They would take, Jesus' teaching and they would understand it very literally when Jesus is teaching about a great spiritual truth. And that's what Thomas does here. He's like, Jesus, I'm going to prepare a place. I'm going to take you there. And Thomas says, well, how do we know? Where are you going? We don't have a map. We don't have GPS. You're not telling us where you're going. We'll never find you. We'll be lost. So Jesus is teaching about something on a different level. He's not just teaching literal. He's talking about a greater spiritual truth. So what is Jesus talking about when he talks about his Father's house and there being rooms in it for us and he's going there to prepare a place for us? Now, the only reference we really have to God having a house is in the Old Testament with the temple. It was the house of God. People would say, let us go to the house of the Lord. Now, it wasn't that that's where God's presence was contained or confined, or, that's where God would eat dinner or something like that. Again, that doesn't make sense. The temple, the house of the Lord, was where people would go to encounter God. That's where his presence dwelt most heavy on earth. And that's where you would go to offer your sacrifices. That's where you would go to worship. That's where they were at for this Passover. They would go to the temple. And so that was God's home. The home was much more about the relationship than about the location, okay? So hear this clearly. That home is not about a location. It's about a relationship that is enjoyed. Let me give a kind of a brief kind of parallel to help us understand this concept. This past year for Thanksgiving, our son Evan did not come home. Instead, we drove the 4 hours to his college. We picked him up, and then we went to Pennsylvania to spend Thanksgiving with some friends. And then on the way back, we dropped off at college, and then we came home. So Evan never was in Michigan. But we went to him, and we had the long car rides and stuff. And when we were there in the car, it was so beautiful. The five of us and our family were together again, and we were laughing and sharing stories and updating each other on each other's life. And it was just wonderful. It was this great, great time. And we experienced something there, like we experienced home. Even though we were in a van or somebody else's house, we experienced home. You see, it wasn't that Evan came home. It was that home went to him. And that's kind of the idea that Jesus is getting at here. So when Jesus promises that he's going to take his disciples somewhere, that he's going to take us somewhere, the place isn't a where, the place is a who. It's about relationship. Where is Jesus going to take us? What is the destination? It's God. It is the near presence of God. Now, again, it's thinking about this differently. It's about a who. It's not about a where. Now, here's why this makes sense. Because Jesus backs this up a bunch in the verses that just follow after this. Again, the disciples, what's their big concern? Losing Jesus, losing fellowship with Jesus, not being with Jesus, being abandoned by Jesus. And what does Jesus say after this? How does he assure his disciples? Verse 3, he says, I will take you to myself. Not I'm going to take you to a big mansion. I will take you to myself. Verse 3, so that where I am, you can also be. Again, a togetherness. Verse 6, Jesus says, no one comes to the Father except through me. So what's the destination there again? The Father. That's where we're going. And nobody gets there. Nobody gets to the Father without Jesus. In verse 18, Jesus reminds them, I will not leave you as orphans. You're not going to be left alone. And then in verse 23, he says, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him. And we will come to him and make our home with him. And that word home there is the same one that Jesus uses earlier. We will make our dwelling with him. Our home, just like with Evan when we traveled, home came to be with him. That's what Jesus is saying to the disciples. Home, the Father and I relationship, we will come to you. So again, this whole passage is not about splendid accommodations in heaven. It's about the promise of being in the near presence of God. And that brings us comfort and assurance. That is the thing that settles our hearts. So now, let me just be clear. I don't want you to hear something that I'm not saying. Are we going to go to heaven when we die if we believe in Jesus? Yes. And when we get there, is it going to be beautiful beyond all description and glory and wonder and splendor? Yes, the Bible teaches us that very clearly. But that's not what Jesus is talking about in John 14. And that's good news, all right? It's good news what Jesus is teaching here, because Jesus is offering the disciples and us something much more immediate. Here's the beauty of John 14. We are already dwelling with God. We are already at home with him. We are already in the room. It's not, again, something that we have to wait for. We can enjoy this and experience this now. Jesus says that is our reality. And because that is true now, we don't have to let our hearts be troubled, no matter what we're going through, because we are already at home with the Father and with him, the Son. So earlier I asked the question, what are we to believe about God to calm our hearts and settle our souls? That we are already home with him. So does this mean, great, my heart will never be troubled ever again? No, that's not what this means. I mean, we just went from the brink of pandemic to World War III in about a week, right? And there's all kinds of stuff that we're dealing with in our lives. I know I am. For those who don't know, my father-in-law passed away about 2 weeks ago, and he was very dear to me and very close. I've known him since I was a kid. And all that was leading up to that, and then all the aftermath, I've had more sleepless nights in the last month than I can remember in a really, really long time. So does this promise mean you'll never have a troubled heart? Nope, you'll have a troubled heart. Well, is it a sin then to have a troubled heart, to be ever discouraged and disappointed and bothered? Is it a sin to, feel like this on the inside? Well, that's not what this is saying either. It's not saying, well, if you have enough trust and enough faith, you'll never be bothered by anything. And I know that's true because Jesus also had a troubled heart. Did you hear that? Jesus' heart was troubled. In the fullness of humanity, he lived also in a world of sin and went through very hard moments. And he was also troubled in his spirit. 3 times, right before Jesus tells his disciples not to be troubled, Jesus himself was troubled. All right, in John 11:33, he's standing outside the tomb of Lazarus. He says, when Jesus saw her, Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. In John 12:27, Jesus is talking about his crucifixion. He goes, now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. And in John 13:21, at the same meal, right before, at the Last Supper, right before Jesus tells them not to be troubled, we read this. Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. When Jesus is telling his disciples, don't be troubled, and he tells us, don't let your hearts be troubled, he isn't telling us to do something he didn't do himself, right? I mean, if anybody could go through life without a troubled heart, it would be Jesus, and he didn't. But what Jesus is telling us here is that when you do have a troubled heart, there is something you can do about it, that there's a solution, there's an antidote, there is a cure for it. And it's this, that we can go to our Father's house. We can be in the near presence of the creator of the universe, the one who loves us infinitely, unconditionally, the one who is almighty and all-powerful. We can draw near to him and be with him. Another way to say it is we can go home. We can go home. We see Jesus doing this in his own life. When Jesus is at the grave of Lazarus, when he's at the Last Supper, and when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating, drops of blood over the anxiety of the cross. He does the same thing in every situation. You know what that is? What does he do? He prays. He prays, he prays, he prays. In those moments when his heart and his soul are troubled, he talks to his Father. He goes to this room in the Father's house. And we see this so powerfully, the effect of this in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is praying. He's on his knees. And by going to the Father's house, he finds courage. He finds this commitment to obey. And he faces the cross with boldness. And he willingly lays his life down without ever flinching or stumbling or thoughts of turning back. Jesus shows us what to do when your heart gets troubled, and it works. And his word to the disciples is the word to us today. If your heart is troubled, he understands it, but he also says it doesn't need to be. What we need to do is draw near. We do that today by taking time to worship, to pray, to be in God's word. Those are the kind of the ways that we draw into God's presence, and we experience his nearness now. We spend time worshiping and praying and reading, and those are the ways that we spend time in his house. Those are the rooms, the three rooms that we might say in his house are worship, prayer, and the word. Now, this promise to not have our hearts be troubled anymore, it isn't universal. Because if God is the destination, then Jesus is the way. Jesus is the one and only way there. In verse 6, Jesus says, no one comes to the Father except through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the way. See, Jesus isn't like any other religious leader who just points the way and says, if you do this and enough of it and you avoid enough of this, you'll find what you're looking for. Jesus himself is the way. Jesus is access to the Father. Jesus is the key and the door into the Father's house. This helps us really understand what Jesus meant when he goes, I'm going there, and I'm preparing the way for you. I'm preparing a place for you. What does prepare mean? It means this, that he was going to die. He was going to go to the cross, and in doing so, he was going to eliminate the sin that separates us from our Father, the sin that blocks us from the near presence of the Father, the sin that keeps us away from the Father's house. It's when Jesus dies on the cross that the curtain where the presence of God was most concentrated, we might say, on earth. In the Holy of Holies, when Jesus died, that curtain is torn. The way into the Father's house was opened for all who would believe. You can only experience the peace of God now if you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, if you believe in him. He is the way to the Father. And you will only experience the glory of heaven one day and the ultimate experience of God's presence through a relationship with Jesus Christ today. And that's why Jesus says to his disciples, believe in me. Believe that I'm the way, and you will have more of my presence than you could have ever imagined. And so that is the word for us today, to believe. Because life isn't going to get any easier. And the future will always be uncertain. And there will always be reasons for our hearts to be troubled. But Jesus Christ offers us this comfort and the assurance that if we believe in him and trust in him, that he will lead us home.